Deyu, written on climbing the Yazhou city wall. I climb the tall tower alone, gaze towards the imperial capital. Even for a bird in flight, the journey is still half a year. Green mountains seem to invite one to stay and settle down. Their hundreds of turns and myriad curves encircle the city walls. Okay, so this is a poem by Deyu. Now, Deyu is not a particularly famous or important poet of the Tang, but he was what almost every poet of the Tang wanted to be. That is to say, a successful scholar official. So Deyu lived in the middle years of the 9th century mostly, and he managed to be a grand counselor under two emperors. Grand counselor was, like the highest possible post in the bureaucracy, and he was also the head of one of two factions that slugged it out in the middle years of the late Tang. There was a lot of infighting in the late Tang court against the eunuchs, and also between factions at court. There were two big factions: the New faction and the Liu faction, both named because of their main representatives, Niu Sengru and Li Deyu. So, very briefly, Li Deyu, well, he was a person that came from a nice family, from a good background family, which gave him an interesting starting position in the bureaucracy. Afterwards, he served in the provinces, but was later then summoned to the court, and there he achieved very high positions. But as we said, at the same time, he started to have these conflicts with political rivals, especially Niu Sengru, and the members of the rival faction of scholar officials. This led to his banishment to the provinces. He would return later, but in the last years of his life, he would be again banished to the most remote areas of the empire. And so I imagine you could say this for the Tang, at least for most of the Tang, and this also applies in the Song dynasty. One good thing was that these quarrels between scholar officials generally did not end in execution, but in exile. Now, Li Deyu was exiled first to Guangdong province and then to Hainan, the island of Hainan, which was where he actually died, and where he actually composed a poem that we've read a minute ago. Now, Hainan Island is in the extreme south of China, just opposite the coast of Guangdong, an area of tropical climate. In the Tang period, it was a semi-barbarian territory with malaria and poisonous snakes and barbarian tribes, hardly a Sinicized place. So, and it was like you couldn't send anybody further away from the empire. It was the last god-forsaken piece of land anywhere. And as I said, this is where Li Deyu died in 850 while he was acting as vice prefect and then revenue manager for Yazhou. In fact, the poem that we've read is written climbing the Yazhou city wall. So as I said, Li Deyu was not particularly famous as a poet. He did have some reputation as a writer for texts and for defending a writing style that was both precise and logical and not slavishly subservient of the past and of old metaphors. Yeah. So this poem of his, what can we say about it? It's not a particularly complex one. It's a quatrain, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It's a heptasyllabic quatrain. So it's a poem, as you have seen, it's pretty straightforward. It doesn't have any obvious literary allusions. So it belongs to a very traditional genre, which we've seen time and time again in this series. The poems on climbing an elevation and looking out afar. Well, remember, this can be done with towers and pavilions or city walls. It can also be done with mountains. This physical, geographical elevation And the expanded view that one gets from heights is metaphorically always equated with insight. Not only can we see further away, we can also know and learn things. That is, when you are in one of these high positions, you are in a predisposed state for knowing and reflecting on true things and on seeing without confusion. So there's this element of climbing a high vantage point in the poem, but there's also another element, very typical in scholar official poetry of scholar officials in exile, longing for the capital, yearning to return to the capital. So this topic is here, but it's not that tragically depicted as it could be. I mean, we will see it when we comment the two couplets, but like there is a contrast. Like the first couplet is, very typically predictive. I climb up, I'm far in the remotest areas of the empire, looking at the capital, longing, thinking of how far the distance is. But then the second couplet at least seems to consider the possibility of staying and settling down, of actually not wanting to return to the imperial capital, which doesn't feel extremely sincere here, but would make some kind of sense. Like we can imagine an old and sick Deyu, utterly disgusted by courtly politics and by his exile and by the intrigues that led him there. So, as I said, the poem is pretty brief, two couplets. So the first couplet, as usual, in a quatrain, like the first couplet presents us with the scenario, and the second couplet tries to attempt a witty resolution. Here we could say there is an element of witty resolution in the subversion of expectations. I mean, we would expect the second couplet to continue playing on the chord of how sad I am, how desolate, far from the empire's heart and far from service and an exile. But no, it actually adopts, as we said, the completely, or it's open. I wouldn't go so far as to say that it adopts a position of, hey, it's great to be here in this backwater where nobody speaks Chinese and where the climate is terrible for a Chinese northerner, and where I don't have other scholar officials to interact. But hey, at least the nature seems inviting, and that's interesting. So first couplet: I climb the tall tower alone, gaze towards the imperial capital. Even for a bird in flight, the journey is still half a year. So like the city walls would have included ramparts and spaces for walking, they might have included tower-like structures, which are a little bit more elevated. So he has climbed the city wall, he has climbed this tower, he's looking afar. Where is he looking for? He's not looking for home, he's looking towards the imperial capital, Chang'an, in the remote northwest of the country. And the second line establishes the distance, if it were needed. Well, it's not needed. If you read this poem, you would know that Yazhou is southernmost China. But if any clarification were needed, the image of a bird in flight taking half a year to reach the capital is pretty realistic. I mean, China is enormous. I'm not sure how many kilometers there are between Hainan Island and Chang'an, but it's probably no less than the distance from Gibraltar to Stockholm, at the very least, if not more. So the capital is out of sight, but not out of mind, and the bird in flight is a common, is a staple, stereotypical image of freedom, of the ability to move, but also of nostalgia and of a desire to communicate with home when in faraway barbarian land. But then, second couplet, green mountains seem to invite one to stay and settle down. Their hundreds of turns and myriad curves encircle the city walls. So the poet looks out to nature, and nature seems, I mean, the verb seem, I'm not sure if it's in the original Chinese, but in the translation it's significant that the verb is seem. The Green Mountains seem to invite one to stay and settle down. Yeah, the poem does not conclude in low spirits, but rather with some level of comfort, like nature wraps him around, and like the mountains, like the walls, encircle him and, create a scenario of beauty and protectiveness, which seems to, as I said, to invite him to stay. So overall, an interesting poem, more from the cultural and historical point of view, perhaps, than from its intrinsic merits. Li Deyu, as I said, died in Yazhou, and 2 years later, in 852, his son Li Ye escorted his coffin back to Luoyang, where he was reinterred in the family plot, and later, in 860, he was reinstated posthumously to his honors and positions.